Good afternoon. We're about to begin a new meeting on this, sponsored by the Builder Center, particularly the Cuba project. We have had already meetings discussing the Republic, that is Cuba before the Revolution. As a little trivia, I must tell you that the revolutionary period as of sometime last year has lasted longer than the Republic. That, however, doesn't mean that the Republic is not important. It's extremely important, and that's not only in explaining itself, but also explaining what happened later. So that's why I think that these meetings of the Cuba Project, the Builder Center, are really critically important. I will be introducing the speakers as their turns come. And first of all, I want to introduce the director of the Builder Center, Mauricio, who is a professor of sociology at the Art Center and a scholar. So, Mauricio.
Gracias. The transition from colony to republic was one heck of a transition in Cuba at the beginning of the Republican era, in 1902. I mean, Spain had been there for 4 centuries. It was a often harsh, occasionally more moderate rule. Cubans had not known self-rule or democracy except for some occasional periods in which things happened. So Cubans entered the 20th century, 1902, with a very little training as to what democracy, republic meant. At some point, we really want to start with today's event and what we had a few weeks ago and what we'll have later in a few more weeks. We will have a kind of a forum on the Cuban Old Republic from 1902, 1958, because we think we can understand the present by better understanding the past. And the past is interesting in its own terms. The 2 basic premises guide our thinking. We look forward to your comments, all of us, and we have excellent people representing new scholarship on the Republic, which we want to kind of note. Just a couple of more points. Cuba, after May 20th, 1902, la inauguración de la República, lacked, for the reasons that I just mentioned to you, reasonably strong and legitimate political institutions. How could it? It did not have a bureaucracy and army. It did not have political parties, effective parties. It had some inklings of a party system, but hardly anything worth modern times in which Cuba was beginning to live. And of course, it lacked effective legislative and court systems. It lacked effective mechanisms of political representation, civil society, and political practice. Enfranchisement was, of course, how could it exist? The Cubans had never voted or rarely voted. So you had to invent enfranchisement parties, processes, institutions. It's a gargantuan task. There were no clear leaders. Jose Marti had died in 1995, the one who launched, the leader who launched the struggle for independence. Antonio Maceo died a year later, 1896. And Máximo Gómez, who was not Cuban, was Dominican, he would die shortly after in 2006, if I am correct. So Cuba really lacked the leaderships to 1906, to lack the leaderships to really organize a coherent struggle for a Republican, democratic, much less democratic life. It lacked a dynamic economy. My goodness. In fact, the Cuban economy was in ruins, especially from the Matanzas area to Oriente, right? Both the policies of Valeriano Weyler, the Spanish rulers at the end of the period of colonial or empire. And then, of course, la política de la tea, no? The policies of the rebels in Ambicias, which was to burn Cañaverales, the sugar mill town. So that the economy was in pretty bad shape. There are some estimates of about a third, at least, gone. I've seen other estimates half. I think they are too high. but the economy was in shambles. Now it recovered quite fast, actually. And of course, Cubans faced U.S. hegemony, right, to the north. Big challenge. The Platt Amendment and Guantanamo irritated Cubans and fueled Cuban nationalism of various kinds. Something that I will shortly mention because there's no time for more. It is noteworthy, in my view, that the very Platt Amendment was used by Cuban caudillos, the military leaders that emerged as they were vying for control of the republic, as kind of strategies to get the U.S. on their side so they would win the elections. In 1906, the reason or a mechanism that was activated to get the Americans in there back at when Estrada Palma won a re-election was precisely this mechanism of threatening un levantamiento and then prompting the U.S. to intervene. I'm not saying the U.S. would not have intervened or is not prone to defend its interests. It was. The U.S. was hegemonic. It was protecting its economic and political strategic interests in the region, and that needs to be also looked at. What I'm saying is that the Cuban leaders, los caudillos, were not just simple passive actors. They were also actively engaged in going to Washington, asking for meetings with the presidents of the U.S., and then requesting mediación, intervención, and what have you. It was a mechanism that would be used through the entire republic, I would say even through the days of the struggle against Batista. And lastly, the big challenge that I see for Cuban, this fledgling, aspiring Cuban republic was the tremendous struggles of the 20th century outside of Cuba, right? The isms, communism, Russian Revolution, Mexican Revolution, the repression in the US. And then we had fascism, which had all of these movements had representation in Cuba, and they influenced processes, as we will see shortly or later in a couple of minutes, right, in Cuba. So Cuba was really trying to build this democracy in this completed transition to democracy, or what we today would call a transition, in a very short period of time, facing pretty strong challenges. And I'm awed that of the things that are the challenges that were faced. Today we want to hear from people who are doing research on various aspects of the creation of civil society, on the development of institutions in Cuba, on the development of the early struggle to develop civil society, which is very little known. So these are the presidents of 1901 Constitutional Platt Amendment, in 1902 Tomás de Palma, he wants to re-elect himself, and then Jose Miguel Gomez leads a rebellion, he gets the U.S. involved, U.S. intervenes, and then you have an intervention from 1906, the second intervention, and then he gets elected president, Jose Miguel Gomez. Then you get Mario Garcia Menocal, who is going to be, he's a conservative, whatever that means at the time. The liberals revolt against him, the same tactic they use. It does not work the way the liberals wanted, and Menocal gets confirmed. Alfredo Sayas in 21, and then Gerardo Machado, a landmark in the first cycle of the Republic, 1921, 1928, and then he seeks re-election. The same thing, the caudillos rebel against him, they try to get the U.S. engaged, they succeed actually with FDR, who sends Sumner Wells. Gerardo Machado is going to be facing internal enemies or adversaries, as well as the emissary of FDR, Sumner Wells. And I think that's a very interesting chapter of how U.S. interventions work or do not work in Cuba. And it would be useful to have someone like Anthony de Palma go back and reconsider the facts of that period. And then I want to stop with the revolution of 1933, because we don't have any more time. Batista, a figure who needs to be reconsidered. Well, they said the second, I want to leave the second period, which is where most of the papers are, will address today here. I'll leave that to the other speakers, but there's a cycle of revolution and movements, and in what Samuel loves to call gangsterism, right in the 30s, 40s, and that leads to, that's part of the republic, democratic republic that lasts from the Constitution of 1940 to 1952, and that's a cycle right there. You have 3 presidents. Batista launches a coup in 1952. He had been emerging as he had become a major leader, a strongman, and evolving in different ways. And then, of course, Castro in 1956, and 1950, here we go again, 1958, U.S. embargo of arms, Batista interrupted. 1958, Batista goes into exile and Castro takes over. Well, I'm going to stop here. I have more things to say about the challenges, but I think this is about time for me to then open the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Thank you. The first speaker is sitting right next to me, and her name is Ariel Lambe. She's a PhD in Columbia University and currently is assistant professor of history at the University of Connecticut. And particularly relevant to this talk is that her research interests are Cuban Anti-Fascism and involvement in the Spanish Civil War, transnational movements, activism networks, and solidarity, the 30s in the Atlantic world. So I think this is a very interesting topic because I for one, have always been fascinated by the fact that close up to 1,000 people, correct me if I'm wrong, close to 1,000 Cuban-born people fought on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. That is probably, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the highest proportion in terms of the population of Cuba at that time, which was probably 4 million and change. So, please,
Thank you very
Dr. Lambe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm very thrilled to be part of this discussion on the Republic, which I'm biased, but I think it's a really important discussion. A couple of apologies right off the bat. I'm recovering from a terrible respiratory illness, so if I begin coughing uncontrollably during my talk, I apologize in advance. I have a cough drop and my water. I'll do my best. And also, this is a 20-minute talk that I'm going to try to squish into. Oh, thank you very much. That I'm going to try to squish into 15 minutes. So I hope it's clear. I work on Cuban anti-fascism, and I'm going to be addressing, I think, not institution building so much as this idea of the creation of a civic society, and a civic society of a particular kind, that of activists and people who saw themselves as creating something that is, you'll see, quite idealistic, but also had a lot of commitment to the idea of building Cuba and the idea of a new Cuba that I'll talk about at some length. In the mid-1930s, diverse Cubans with long-standing commitment to the idea of a new Cuba reinterpreted their struggle as anti-fascism. Frustrated by strongman and neo-colonial control of their country, they reacted by cultivating solidarity transnationally. They did not view domestic political goals as confined to the island and therefore unattainable during repressive times. Rather, they reacted to repression at home by crossing borders and oceans, sometimes literally, and other times through networks of communication and support, insisting all the while that their transnational move reinforced rather than weakening their commitment to the Cuban struggle. Expanding their efforts to encompass fights in other lands, these Cubans engaged with the defense of Ethiopia against Mussolini's invasion in 1935 and the defense of the Spanish Republic against Franco's rebellion beginning in 1936. They believed that it would be precisely through these ostensibly foreign fights that they would achieve their political goals at home. Today I will describe briefly the development of this seemingly paradoxical stance with an emphasis on the role and importance of the emotion and idea of hope. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, many Cubans rose up against their president-turned-dictator, Gerardo Machado, and against U.S. dominance of their country's government and economy. Their domestic political goals included an end to strongman control and strongman governance and neo-colonial control, as well as progress towards social and economic justice and some form of democracy and/or revolution. Often they summarized this set of goals as a new Cuba. Though the nature of the aims differed, sometimes greatly, between different individuals and groups, diverse Cubans found a degree of unity in their desire for substantial change. The struggle against Machado in the aftermath of his 1933 fall constituted a period during which hope both helped produce and fed off of progress towards such change. Reflecting on her activism in the fight against Machado, a young woman named Tete Casuso described the aftermath of his fall using the metaphor of a dam. On the, quote, peaceful solution orchestrated by U.S. Special Ambassador Sumner Welles to remove Machado through negotiated coup, she commented, "As always happens when there is total ignorance of a people's deepest problems, those responsible for this neat arrangement suddenly found themselves confronted by a broken dike." From her perspective, U.S. officials seeking to avoid revolution had, quote, only succeeded in filling the dam till it burst. The fight continued against Machado's U.S.-backed successor, and after a chaotic period of intense struggle, hope ascended. Cubans like Tete felt jubilation in victory and intense energy and momentum of progress during Grau's brief presidency. They believed for a short time that they were finally achieving their goals. Then Fulgencio Batista rose to power as a new strongman, and the vision of a new Cuba on the horizon receded. The Grau government fell apart, and the year 1934 saw tumult and violence escalate as many anti-Machado activists turned their attention to combating the new enemy. The fight continued throughout 1934 and into the following year, but when Batista's forces crushed a general strike in March 1935, it seemed a final defeat. Tete Casuso wrote bitterly that the new strongman had achieved the peace and quiet Welles had desired in 1933, but it was, quote, the peace of the absent and the quiet of the dead. The dike broken in 1933 was rebuilt, the revolutionary waters once again contained. Choosing quiescence or leaving the island, many Cubans stepped momentarily out of the reservoir behind that dam. Casuso and her husband, activist intellectual Pablo de la Torrente Brau, were two of those who left the island following the general strike's collapse. Removed from the current of struggle back home and stuck in record-breaking heat in New York City in midsummer 1936, Torrente began to daydream about water. Bored and disdainful of glittering trivialities in the big city, he lamented that he got swept away by the, quote, nocturnal river of Broadway, that at the door of each burlesque, each movie theater makes whirlpools. The vitality of a pro-Republican rally in Union Square jolted him from his languid tedium, and he decided to travel across the ocean to participate in the conflict recently begun in Spain. He imagined that there he would get swept away by, quote, the river of revolution and the great silent whirlpool of death. More importantly, he would learn lessons for the Cuban struggle. The Republican fight, he wrote, would teach Cubans, quote, that when a people wishes to fight to the death for its ideals and necessities, there is no barrier that can contain it. Thus, Torrente established two intertwined ideas central to the transformation of the struggle for a new Cuba into anti-fascism. First, he imagined a continuity, a flow of revolution that could not be contained either by repression or by national boundaries. And second, he saw the need to teach this image, this idea, to his fellow Cubans in order to sustain the fight at home during repressive times. It was his activism in Cuba that prepared and propelled him to defend the Spanish Republic, and his writing would serve as a conduit back to his countrymen for the vital revolutionary lessons that he felt the Spanish Republicans had for them. His movement across borders and oceans and that of his ideas helped inspire Cubans both to help the Spanish Republic and to continue the fight at home. Torrente had influence both in life and in death. He entered the conflict as a war correspondent, a role well matched to his talents and which garnered him a good deal of attention. However, compelled by the desperate attempt to defend Madrid against nationalist advance late in 1936, he took up arms. When the danger is past, he wrote to his wife, I will return to my typewriter. But on December 19, 1936, he was killed in battle. Tete learned of her husband's death in a newspaper. Grief-stricken, she sought some activity to keep herself occupied through her mourning. She wrote, I determined to do something to help the unhappy people for whose liberty Pablo had given his life. In Havana in mid-March of 1937, she founded the Central Organization of Cuban Aid to Republican Children, with the support of, quote, the generous initiative of a group of enthusiastic people. This group of, oh, excuse me, I skipped that slide. That's the rally in Union Square. Sorry, that's the rally. That's the rally in Union Square, forgive me. And here is an homage to Pablo after his death. And this is the one I meant to be on. The generous initiative of a group of enthusiastic people, this group included many of her compañeros from the earlier struggles, some of them quite prominent, as well as numerous extant Cuban organizations that turned their attention to the pro-Republican fight at this time. Thus, she built her anti-fascist organization upon interpersonal relationships, networks, and institutions from the Cuban domestic struggle. The tone of her memoir, dull with grief following her discovery of her husband's death, brightens with her pride for this association. It had 300,000 members, she boasted, all across the island and in Cuban communities abroad. And she was particularly proud of the Casa Escuela Pueblo de Cuba, which was founded in the Catalan town of Sitges by the association and run by Rosa Pastora Leclerc, who's all the way to your right there, a black Cuban educator of note at the time who was sent by this association to Spain to teach these orphans. Already an activist for years, she was well acquainted with sacrifice. This is back to Tete. But Torriente's death could have marked an endpoint, a tragedy too great to overcome. Like Torriente, however, and in fact through his death, she transferred her activist work from the Cuban struggle to the defense of the Spanish Republic. At a point of extreme vulnerability personally, she found resilience and activist continuity by caring for vulnerable children of her imagined brothers and sisters in Spain's fight against fascism, children who represented in her organization, as her organization stated again and again, the hope of the world. Like many Cuban anti-fascists, Casuso and the activists in her organization used as one tool to build transnational solidarity with the Spanish Republic the idea of kinship, a set of historic, cultural, and familial ties between two countries that had less than 4 decades earlier been one. Anti-fascist Cubans reconciled their anti-colonial history with their pro-Republican stance by defining the Republic as a new Spain, as opposed to an old Spain identified not only with Franco, but with all of the infamous bygone enemies of Cuba's 19th century wars of independence. For example, they compared the suffering of Cubans under Tacón and Weyler to that of Spaniards at the hands of nationalists, whom they viewed as successors to the island's colonial rulers. The comparison with Weyler was particularly chilling for Cubans observing European fascism, since he had led Spanish military forces fighting against Cuban independence to intern civilians in brutal concentration camps. If fascists sought to do in Europe what Weyler had done in Cuba, then Cubans were natural and experienced anti-fascists. And if Franco was Weyler's descendant and the Republicans the Numambises, then Cubans should feel no conflict fighting for Spain, despite their anti-colonial heritage. Thus, Cuban anti-fascism became a fight both for a new Spain and a new Cuba, and for progress in the, quote, motherland, as well as fulfillment of yet unattained promises of the Cuban Wars of Independence. These two fights, the Spanish and the Cuban, became one and the same in the minds of many Cuban anti-fascists, more so than any others. Yet there were some Cubans who felt a stronger kinship tie to a different anti-fascist struggle, the defense of Ethiopia, a country viewed by many within the African diaspora as a symbolic motherland, representative of the freedom and dignity of black people worldwide. Black Cuban activists concerned with Mussolini's invasion were vocal anti-fascists on the island prior to the Spanish Civil War. They did identify with the African diaspora, but they also worked to connect black Cuban anti-fascism to currents of Cuban history and a general Cuban public. By the mid-1930s, some politically minded black Cubans had moved away from traditional elite black leaders and worked to organize a renovation of black Cuban political activism. These more radical Cubans of color made up one part of the broad fight against Machado, and they considered their anti-fascism a continuity of their domestic experiences and goals. Their bulletin Adelante served as a venue for defending the cause of Ethiopia on the island. Oh. I lost a slide. Forgive me. Okay, one of my slides got deleted. I'm sorry. There's a wonderful picture of an Ethiopian mother with bombs falling on her, being triumphant against fascism. Forgive me for having lost that. Like other Cuban anti-fascists, contributors to Adelante connected anti-fascism to the island's anti-colonial history. Cuba had fought heroically for liberty against a country vastly more powerful than itself, they stated, just as Ethiopia did now and had done before. The Ethiopian war against Italy in the 19th century took place during the Cuban Wars of Independence. And Black Cuban anti-fascists described this history to Cuban readers, trying to build a sense of connection between the two countries. They compared Cuba and Ethiopia not only in terms of Cuba's fight against Spain, but also the United States. I'm going to skip ahead here because I know I'm running out of time. But the end point of this is that Cubans who fought for Ethiopia at some point realized it was a lost cause and transferred their allegiance to the Spanish Republic. This was also true of African Americans. And Nicolas Guillen was one of the strong proponents of this switch and did a lot of work to try to explain why it was relevant for Black Cubans to defend Spain, including claiming that all Cubans were Spanish, even if they didn't have Spanish genealogy, which was, of course, a controversial point. Like the island's history of Spanish colonization and anti-colonial struggles, the more recent fights against strongman control and neocolonialism provided specific reference points and symbols for Cuban anti-fascists. Because I'm running out of time, I'm going to go off script and just describe these two briefly. So the first is Julio Antonio Mella, whom, if you're familiar with the Republican period, you know, founder of the first Cuban Communist Party, and a strong student activist and leader of the anti-Machado struggle. So in the Cuban anti-fascist movement, we have two examples of carrying Julio Antonio Mella forward into anti-fascism. The first is the Club Julio Antonio Mella in New York City, which is the principal recruitment center for Cuban volunteers who were in exile in New York City to go to Spain. And then the Club Julio Antonio Mella in Barcelona, which served as a center of the Western Hemisphere, if we will, in our given setting, for both North and Latin American volunteers and visitors during the Spanish Civil War to sit and talk about the war and world politics and so forth. And you'll see here, you may recognize Mella. The other man there is Torriente. So we have one of the central martyrs of the anti-Machado struggle next to the first martyr of the Cuban effort to defend Spain. And the second figure, main figure, martyred figure of the anti-Machado struggle and anti-Batista struggle that is carried forward literally in this case in the form of a banner into Spain is Antonio Guiteras. So the Cuban section of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, which you may have heard of, this is one of the major battalions of U.S. volunteers. There is a Cuban section of this battalion, and it is named the Centuria Antonio Guiteras by its leader, Rodolfo de Armas, who was an activist in Joven Cuba. So these are a couple of the examples that I use regarding the volunteers themselves, and it's exactly right that there are approximately 1,000 volunteers, which is by far the most of any Latin American country, and as you pointed out, proportionally to the population at large is a huge number. So these are just a couple of images of some of those volunteers. This is a photo that I discovered in an unmarked box in Albacete, Spain. And this is a photo that was published in the book of the 15th International Brigade, which came to be known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. It was dominated by North Americans. Okay. May I conclude with two very shortly, or am I out of time? I can skip
you're out of time.
Okay, I'll skip the conclusion. We can just talk in question and answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Well, very stimulating indeed. Our next speaker is my old friend Michelle Chase, who, as an advertisement, I will emphasize the fact that she just published a book called Revolution Within the Revolution, Women and Gender in the Period of 52 to 58. And that's published by the University of North Carolina Press, as many of us know as probably the principal publisher of books on Cuba. And she got her PhD from NYU a few years ago and is now assistant professor at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. So, Michelle.
Thanks very much. I was really pleased to be invited to this panel since I think the topic of the Republic is so important. And thank you everyone for braving the snow and the cold weather. I'm just going to say for a moment something about where this talk is coming from today. And I'm hoping to be brief. I know that we only have a limited amount of time. But my book is about the period of 1952 to 1962. I think you said 58. I go all the way up to 1962. So it's really about the end of the Republican period and the beginning of the Revolutionary period. And in the book, I try to argue for the importance of both women as historical actors and also ideas about gender, about masculinity, and about femininity to kind of the whole political process between 1952 and 1962, especially in the urban centers. That's what I focus on in the book. And so just a little bit of background, as I was doing some of my research and looking at the really important and exciting period of 1959 and 1960, I'm sure you guys all know and can imagine how exciting that period was, I saw a lot of small groups of pro-revolutionary women. There were new groups who had names with something like, pro-revolutionary women, etc., and so on, that formed in this period. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that I believe it was from these women's groups, these small women's groups of different political persuasions that really raised the idea of women's rights in that context for the first time. And some of these women, as I looked into kind of who they were, I noticed that some of these groups coincided quite closely with a group that had existed in the late 1940s and the late 1950s. It was a group affiliated with the Communist Party, the pre-revolutionary Communist Party, and the name of the group was the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, or FDMC for its initials, which is how I'm going to refer to it today. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus on this group, and I want to argue, perhaps counterintuitively for some people here and elsewhere, that in Cuba in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Marxist left had a very developed and progressive program for women's liberation. Now, by that I mean it was advanced for its time, right? The late 1940s, that early 1950s, that kind of mid-century downtime of feminism in Cuba and elsewhere. Some of you may already be familiar with the wonderful book written by Kay Lynn Stoner, a path-breaking book about feminism in Cuba. And as she shows, it's called From the House to the Street, as she shows, Cuba was one of the most important sites of first-wave feminism throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So there was a vibrant feminist movement that existed throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. But that early feminist movement had waned by 1940. The 1940 Constitution recognized women's suffrage and instituted some other gender-based reforms. And the 1940s and the 1950s marked a kind of low tide for feminist organizing within Cuba. But so I want to argue that in this period, you see that Cuba's Marxist left did develop a fairly robust platform for women's rights, which I think it's fair to describe as feminist. Of course, they themselves did not use that term. The left in Cuba and elsewhere often avoided the term feminist because of the occasionally conservative positions held by self-declared feminists historically elsewhere, and also because of a related assumption that feminism was something bourgeois, right? But also just that we can view it as a kind of feminism nonetheless, what we might call party feminism, for lack of a better word, because it falls within a very broad definition of feminism, such as an opposition to the existing hierarchy between men and women, a belief that the sexual hierarchy is neither natural nor divinely ordained, and the will to engage in collective action to change those existing inequalities. So departing from that very broad definition, I'm going to posit that this group, we can see it as a feminist, an unrecognized feminist group within Cuban history. And crucially, one of the things I think it's important to recognize is that the platform, the series of demands around women's rights developed by this group was developed transnationally, especially in dialogue with the socialist world. So that rather than see this as a relationship as a kind of limiting framework that established a kind of Soviet line on women's rights, I think it's more interesting to think about it as something that was simultaneously productive and limiting, that allowed them to engage and think about these issues while also restraining them in some other ways. So why do I think that the history of this group might be important? It will allow us to rethink standard narratives of the revolution. I don't have a lot of time to go into that here, but in my book I talk about how we can use this kind of history to rethink these top-down narratives of women's emancipation after 1959 as being kind of part of the initiative of a visionary and progressive leadership. it certainly helps us rethink the history of the party, of the Communist Party, as communist parties in Cuba and elsewhere are also often assumed to not have any meaningful program for women's rights. So I want to rethink that a little bit. And then for the purposes of the panel today, it also helps us rethink the Republican period and the legacy that actors from that Republican period left in the early revolutionary period. So again, I'm going to talk today about this group, the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, the FDMC. I'll first go into a little bit of just kind of an overview about it, say something about their program and their platform, and then conclude with a couple of more thoughts about its importance. So the FDMC, it was technically the local Cuban affiliate of an international pro-Soviet women's group that many of you may have heard of, the Women's International Democratic Front. Now, as scholarship on these chapters throughout the world is beginning to show, sometimes these local chapters of the WIDF they functioned sort of as women's section of the local Communist Party and sort of controlled by the leaders of the Communist Party. But in other cases, they were sort of more autonomous organizations. And traditionally, as I was saying, there's a tendency to kind of scoff at these Cuban women's groups as merely tools of the Soviet leadership, not authentically devoted to women's rights. At the same time, there's a trend, I think, in recent historiography that has provided a much more thoughtful engagement with histories of gender and sexuality on the Marxist left or in the socialist bloc. But again, there's kind of a tendency to recognize some of what was going on, but also an emphasis on the conservatism of the left in those realms. So I'm sympathetic to those arguments. I also think it's important not to engage in a caricature of the Marxist left. And here I'm thinking of the influential book that was published by Kate Wiegand called Red Feminism, where she argues for taking a more complex approach to the party, to not see it as a monolith. And in her own study, she looks at the Communist Party USA as a loose group that encompasses these different and competing ideas about gender and gender reform. She sees the party as kind of a space for debate and for conflict, not simply imposed uniformity. Now, in the Cuban case, at least so far, I don't always have the documents to flesh out those kind of subtleties, but I think it's a useful methodological approach that we can adopt. So with these thoughts in mind, let's take a look at the FDMC's stated program for women's liberation seriously, and then to think about its strengths and weaknesses in the historical context of mid-century Cuba. So first, what do we know about this group? It was formed in 1948. It grew to relatively significant national prominence during a so-called campaign for peace that was carried out on the island by the Communist Party, and this group was part of that in 1950 and 1951, which, as you know, that was the onset of the Korean War, and the Cuban government initially pledged to send troops to help the U.S. effort. Now, to further that peace campaign, the FDMC established organizational chapters and, quote, mothers' committees in towns all throughout the country, and brought hundreds of delegates from all over the island to its March 1951 Congress. So I think that that's important. It was a group that tried to get out of the urban context and get across the island and reach women in many small rural towns. Now, the State Department was concerned enough about the success of that 1950 and 1951 peace campaign, particularly a signature campaign launched by this group that tried to argue against sending Cuban troops to Korea, because it seemed to spread a little bit beyond the milieu of the communist left, attracting kind of more mainstream but progressive cultural figures in Cuba. And it actually spurred the Department of State to launch their own counter-campaign, warning potential signatories that the campaign was being run by the Communist Party. So I'll show you guys. This is just one leaflet that I happened to find of the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, Women Kind of National Congress in 1950. Again, kind of the heyday of this group. So you can see some of the things that we're calling for: the rights of women and children, the defense of democratic rights. Against firings and against the lowering of salaries, against the what do you call it? Desalojo.
Eviction.
Removal of peasants. Yes, exactly. Against forced unionization and for peace. But what I really wanted to show you actually was this. This is a counter pamphlet that was created by the State Department that just says, before you sign, you should know that this peace campaign is being run by communists. I know this is a little bit hard to read, but I just wanted to show that to you guys. The FDMC also sent delegates to the USSR to work on the preparation of international campaigns or to attend major conferences. For example, in 1948, they sent a delegate of several women to the WIDF Congress that was held in Hungary. And occasionally they sent individual militants to take long trips across the Soviet bloc and elsewhere So, for example, Julia Alvarez, she was the editor of a women's section of the Communist Party newspaper called Noticias de Hoy. She took a very long trip in 1951 throughout the Soviet bloc and subsequently to other countries in Latin America. And let me show you just one more image. This is sort of little comic strip that comes from the publication of the group, and it just gives you kind of a sense of them chiding their members to get out the magazine quickly and to get it out beyond kind of their neighbors and stuff. So in the first one, you see a woman kind of knocking on her neighbor's door to a housewife, and she's giving her their magazine. And it says, that's not enough. It has to get beyond that to workshops, to factories, and to the countryside. Right? Just gives you a sense, like I said, they're trying to get beyond the urban milieu out to the rural areas. And the second one, it was also from published in another edition of the magazine, shows it kind of, again, chiding their membership not to sit on these magazines for too long when they come out to start sending them out. So it says, 1st of June, 2nd of June, 3rd of June, the magazine's still sitting there, and the caption says, it shouldn't be like this. The 1st of June, you guys take this magazine and go out and deliver it. So, and then just another image that will give you a sense kind of the magazine and of the group. It gives you a sense of kind of how there was sort of some cognitive dissonance sometimes with their covers. They could have covers that really emulated kind of the American fashion magazines of the time, and then other covers which I think were a little bit more interesting and perhaps even transgressive in their period, in their context, right? So we can broadly characterize their platform as being kind of a left feminist or social justice feminism, which saw gender equality as being linked to broader socioeconomic concerns. For example, in particular, they wanted labor protections and labor rights for women. Guided by their pro-Soviet umbrella group and by images of women's emancipation in the Soviet Union, the FDMC elaborated a local program for women's civic, political, and economic rights. So, for example, they repeatedly asserted that women had rights, quote, as mothers, as workers, and as citizens. In their 1953 Declaration of the Rights of Women, they called for the rights to work, to equal pay for equal work, to social security, and for the rights of women and children to, quote, protection from the state. They also called for equal civil rights regarding marriage, property, and children, the right to vote and hold office, the extension of industrial workers' rights to workers of the countryside, and the rights of peasant women to own land. They called for state subsidies for large families and the unemployed, for the construction of affordable housing units, and for a whole series of measures that might help working mothers, such as daycare centers and breastfeeding rooms in sites of employment, sites of industrial employment in particular. They also stressed women's quote-unquote special vocation for peace, right? And you see that in that campaign that I'm talking about, a term which was used kind of as a shorthand within the Soviet Union for opposition to Western military aggression and nuclear buildup during the Cold War. And I would argue that the group also tried to adapt some of these demands to a Cuban context, so they weren't merely parroting or emulating, kind of quoting what the WIDF globally was suggesting. So just for a couple of examples of how I think that this allowed them, this contact with the WIDF allowed them to think generatively about what was going on in Cuba. They spoke quite directly about how gender inequality was linked to structural problems, right? So in Cuba in particular, they talked about the need to end monoculture, the cyclical unemployment that was affiliated with the sugar industry, the fostering of national identity. And I think another interesting example would be the attention that they paid both to peasant women and to women of color, right? Both important things within the Cuban context. So rather than assume that peasant women would naturally benefit from the material uplift of their male counterparts, which is something you see reiterated in the left throughout Latin America, they tried to really understand the specificity of rural women's exploitation. For example, one article in their magazine described peasant women as kind of a mixture of a housewife and a peon estate who simultaneously is engaged in caring for children in the home and farming and raising animals. And in terms of the issues of race, I think they went beyond what you could describe as a kind of hegemonic approach to racial inequality and racism in Cuba, which tended to focus on reform of the public sphere and kind of downplay the need for anti-racist consciousness raising and transformation of the private sphere. And the FDMC, in contrast, called for like a vast educational campaign directed towards eradicating backwards beliefs, and they denounced any kind of discrimination against dark-skinned women in the workplace and elsewhere. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to conclude then by saying something about the legacy of the FDMC again and why I think that's important. I'm hoping with these arguments and with what I do in the book to kind of shift some of these assumptions about about how the new revolutionary leadership turned to women's issues by trying to uncover this kind of interesting period in the late 1940s and late 1950s, a period very understudied in the historiography, but where there was actually this group that was talking about women's liberation, and like I said, a rather progressive way for its time. And then I believe it was these women, a lot of these women, who subsequently joined kind of these new revolutionary groups that emerged in 1959, 1960. And then they went on also to often take on leadership positions in the Federation of Cuban Women after mid-1960. Usually when people talk about the history of women in this period, it starts with mid-1960. And so I'm trying to look at kind of the backstory and where some of those ideas and where some of those activists came from. So I'm just going to leave you with one last series of images. I don't have time to go into this now, but in my book I talk about the way kind of the early platform around women's rights that emerged in the very first years of the revolution, the way it drew on some ideas coming out of kind of the women who had participated in the insurrection, had been members of the 26th of July movement and other insurrectionary groups, but also drew very heavily on the ideas of these women who had been part of the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas. And you just see this visually, right? This is the icon of the WIDF, right? The one in the upper left. And this is a pamphlet that kind of shows a similar idea of the woman and the dove and so on. And this down here, maybe some of you have seen it, this was kind of the first logo of the FMC. And you see how similar it is with the dove and the coroner and the globe and the woman with the baby, right? It wasn't until later that they added the gun and the image of Vilma Spin, right? So just to suggest kind of visually something that I think was an important dynamic in terms of understanding the legacy of this group and of other Republican politics in the early revolutionary period. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. The next speaker is Tomás Fernández, whom I've heard about for many, many decades, and finally had the chance to meet him in person. He's one of those legendary figures of people who go to Cuba. His presentation will be in Spanish, and he has been a scholar at the José Martí National Library since 1962, where he has studied Afro-Cuban issues. So he's also associate professor at the University of Havana.
Bueno, para ir alentando los motores, sí, porque como buen cubano vamos a usar expresiones cubanas, ¿no? Realmente para mí agradezco mucho a Mauricio la posibilidad de estar una vez más aquí con ustedes y estoy hablando en español porque siempre tengo la intención de hablar en español sobre los temas que me apasionan. Y yo realmente en estos momentos soy más activista comunitario que académico, sin dejar de ser académico, porque ya yo estoy cansado de que la academia se reúne, hace investigaciones y se quedan en la academia y no van a los barrios, no van a los centros obreros, no esparcen el conocimiento. Entonces, me interesó mucho las dos ponencias anteriores porque justamente la República, desde los 20, porque precisaron a partir de los 20 hasta el 50 y pico, presenta tantos problemas, tantos baches, tantas amarguras, tantas tragedias, tantos desengaños y uno de los problemas fundamentales de nuestra historia es que nuestra historia se ha visto con una visión eurocéntrica. Fuimos educados por una sociedad esclavista, por la sociedad esclavista, los poderes coloniales impusieron sus lenguas, su cultura, su religión y todo lo que no fuera, bendito sea de Europa, era algo satánico. Y justamente en este contexto pienso hablar brevemente, porque me interesa más dejar tiempo para el debate, porque lo que nos enriquece es mucho más el debate que las ideas que nosotros podemos expresar. En nuestra república, obviamente, Fernando Ortiz es como un José Martí del siglo XX. Nada se puede decir de Fernando Ortiz que no sea bueno, porque es como si fuera un investigador inmaculado que no cometió errores, y hay que comprender que independientemente de los errores que puede haber cometido por la época, por su formación eurocéntrica también, por supuesto, él se fijó en un aspecto muy importante de nuestra identidad cultural que históricamente la historiografía burguesa ha tratado de eliminar, de silenciar. Y justamente hay una frase que Fernando Ortiz lo dijo en un evento en el Club Atenas, donde decía que Cuba sin el negro no sería Cuba. Y yo pienso que no solamente Cuba, yo pienso que América sin el negro no pudiera ser la América que es en la actualidad. Porque en Brasil el negro es un aporte importantísimo. En Colombia, el país hispano donde hay la mayor población de negros, no sería Colombia. Es decir, que hay que ser un poco más, ¿cómo decirle?, dialéctico. Porque no hay nada perfecto, ni nada, no hay nada tan bueno ni nada tan malo. Y justamente Fernando Ortiz tuvo la virtud, o como se le llama, el tercer descubridor de Cuba. A mí la palabra descubridor no me gusta, porque ni me gusta que el descubrimiento de América, pero si ya América existía, ya los aborígenes, los verdaderos dueños de este continente estaban aquí. ¿Y quién llegaron? Los santos bendecidos, los blancos bendecidos, y por el poder del arma se robaron todas las tierras de los aborígenes. ¿Y dónde están los aborígenes de este país en este momento? En fin, ustedes eso lo saben mejor que yo, así que no voy a hablar de algo que ustedes conocen mucho más. Fernando Ortiz, es indiscutible que su obra es algo impresionante y ha sido muy aportativa, analizándola con un sentido crítico. El segundo personaje que yo trato, que menciono en mi ponencia, es Juan Marinelo. ¿Por qué Juan Marinelo yo lo incluí? Porque Juan Marinelo realmente no se destacó por su lucha antirracista, pero él tiene unos textos muy importantes que publicó en la columna Ideales de una raza, columna escrita que llegó un momento en que se amplió a una página dominical por ese gran periodista que lamentablemente murió en el 58 y que por esas razones que pasan en nuestros países cuando hay revoluciones, porque había estado ligado con Batista, pues desapareció de nuestra historiografía. Y una de las cosas que yo me he dado, es decir, parte de mi activismo, es dar a conocer la obra de Gustavo Urrutia, que es realmente muy impresionante. Y Juan Marinelo, y la coincidencia entre Juan Marinelo, Fernando Ortiz, Gustavo Urrutia y Juan René Betancourt, posiblemente los dos primeros, no sé hasta qué punto sean más conocidos que Gustavo Urrutia y que Juan René Betancourt. Los dos primeros son blancos, estos dos últimos son negros. En que todos consideraban que veían el mestizaje como la solución del problema racial en Cuba, particularmente, pero para mí eso es un mito, eso es una ilusión quimérica, porque la solución del problema racial no es el mestizaje. Puede contribuir, es decir, puede ser una vía, pero no es la más importante ni la única. Y hay diferencias entre ellos. Por ejemplo, Juan Marinelo daba por seguro que una vez que todos en Cuba fuéramos mestizos, el problema negro se resolvía ipso facto. Era un poco con esa ilusión que también lo señaló en cierta ocasión críticamente nuestro poeta nacional, que se conoce mucho por su poesía, pero no se le conoce por su pensamiento antirracista. Y Nicolás Guillén decía una cosa muy importante. Él escribió 3 artículos en el año 29, casi uno detrás del otro, El camino de Harlem, llamando la atención de que La Habana no podría convertirse en tener un barrio al estilo de Harlem. Y entonces otro artículo que decía, el blanco, y ahí el peligro. Y el último era a la conquista del blanco. Entonces, pero también él como miembro del Partido Comunista, y esto es una de las cosas que tuvo el Partido Comunista, que en fin, se le critica en algunos casos, en otros casos se pondera, de que creyeron que una vez que la clase obrera hiciera su revolución y tuviera el poder, ipso facto la discriminación racial desaparecía. Sin embargo, en Cuba hubo una revolución, no obrera totalmente, pero ideológicamente armada con la filosofía obrera, y nosotros tenemos todavía a esta altura el problema de la discriminación racial en nuestro país. No exactamente igual como en otros países, porque obviamente en todos los países la discriminación racial existe, pero de acuerdo con las particularidades de cada república, de cada región. Gustavo Urrutia tuvo la virtud, y esto es muy importante, él mismo se ponía como ejemplo de un negro azul. Ustedes lo verán ahora cuando yo soy yo soy un bibliotecario y un investigador al estilo del siglo XIX. Yo me siento muy familiarizado con Antonio Bachiller y Morales y toda esa gente, y estas tecnologías a veces me dan mareo, me dan mareo. Así. Bueno, aquí tienen a Fernando Ortiz, de quien ya hablé, y aquí tenemos a Gustavo Urrutia. Da la casualidad que Gustavo Urrutia y Fernando Ortiz nacen en el mismo año, 1881. Entonces, para sintetizar, porque ya me pasaron el papelito, y esto es otra cosa que siempre insisto, en que cuando se va a hacer un evento, no debe, es decir, dos personas o más eventos, porque la parte más interesante, y yo pensando que estaba haciendo una síntesis, fíjense lo que es la ilusión de que estaba haciendo una síntesis. Gustavo Urrutia escribió para los negros, para crearle la autoestima a los negros de su valor, de su concientización, de los valores de la cultura negra. Él, por ejemplo, él fue muy famoso en Cuba, se le hicieron muchas caricaturas. Entonces, él lamentablemente no publicó mucho, aunque escribió, ahora mismo, yo voy a enseñar después algo, el punto de vista del nuevo negro, que tiene que ver mucho con el negro en la República, es decir, con la situación del negro en la República, un libro, un texto antológico, ensayo antológico, y otro texto que es 4 charlas radiofónicas, donde él escribió y habló por radio, hablando de que el negro no se tenía que sentir avergonzado de las creencias y de sus abuelos, y entre otras cosas. Este es Juan Marinelo, que ya no voy a mencionarlo más, y este es Juan René Betancourt. Juan René Betancourt, camagüeyano.
¿Y Urrutia dónde era?
Habanero. Y Urrutia era descendiente de un príncipe africano que está todo muy... Bueno, ¿qué pasó ahora? Bueno, la cuestión es que Juan René Betancourt tiene un proyecto en la República para el desarrollo del negro separado del blanco. Aparentemente, no, porque él pide la ayuda de los blancos, porque la clase económica adinerada era blanca, no la negra. Y él crea la Organización Nacional de Recuperación Económica para crear tiendas, etcétera, etcétera. Y él publica en el año 55 un libro sumamente importante y desconocido en Cuba, que yo he tratado de que lo publique nuevamente, pero hasta ahora nada, que es Doctrina Negra. Y ya en el 59 publica El Negro Ciudadano del Futuro, donde reproduce mucha de su teoría de doctrina negra de cómo luchar contra el racismo en Cuba. Y de Gustavo Urrutia, yo acabo de entregar a la editorial, a La Habana, una compilación, una selección de sus textos, porque es importante que se conozca esos textos. Y cuando apareció ahí, Margaret Rose Martin era una African American que vivía en Cuba en los años, mira, ayúdame, en los años 30 en Cuba, y una revista alemana, fíjense en qué año 30, una revista alemana ya el fascismo está en Alemania, pero parece que la academia estaba todavía un poco libre, y dedica un número especial al negro en América. Y le piden a ella que escriba un artículo sobre el negro en Cuba. Cuando yo compilé la bibliografía de temas afrocubanos en los años 70, pero se publicó en los 80, yo me quedé asombrado del artículo que esa mujer escribió en Cuba en el año 30. Y recientemente, cuando lo releí, viendo toda esta apertura de que ahora Estados Unidos y Cuba estamos otra vez amigos, dándonos besos y creando muchas cosas, ¿qué ocurre? Que cuando yo leo aquello, ese artículo escrito en el año 30, parece que había sido escrito ayer. Porque hay un inciso donde dice el turismo americano en Cuba. Y lo que dice es lo que estamos diciendo todos nosotros ahora en la isla. Y por lo tanto, yo lo que hice fue que reproduje ese artículo como una introducción y lo metí en internet para que se conozca. Porque una de las razones que nosotros estamos con el activismo, no solamente histórico, cultural, social, es porque vamos a la historia, pero no para quedarnos con el conocimiento histórico, sino para impartirlo, para que se vea que muchos de los problemas que estamos enfrentando hoy ya fueron enfrentados por las generaciones pasadas. Y por favor, perdóneme, maestro, que me haya tomado 5 minutos, pero para mí hablar de estos temas no es dar una clase, no es dar una conferencia, es hacer activismo, es hacer conciencia, y esto por eso mismo lo hago en Cuba. Aquí yo no tengo que hacer conciencia porque para qué están los estadounidenses que tienen que hacer eso. Pero aprendamos, sepamos que en todo nuestro continente en la actualidad, todas las comunidades afrodescendientes están luchando por la reivindicación, por las reparaciones, para que se conozca la historia. Incluso, un minuto nada más, incluso cuando yo era muchacho, yo oía decir en Cuba que el negro cubano era superior al negro americano. ¿Por qué era superior? Porque, y usted lo debe recordar, porque ustedes y yo somos más o menos de las mismas candilejas, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué ocurrió? Porque el negro cubano había luchado supuestamente por su independencia, porque nunca se ha dicho que hubo negros que pelearon a favor de España. Eso no aparece en la historia de Cuba, nunca, 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 nunca. Y entonces, la historia que se ve de Estados Unidos en las películas, aunque últimamente han aparecido cosas diferentes, pero la historia de los que hemos crecido en mi generación era que gracias a Lincoln, el norte había dado la libertad a los negros. Y ustedes saben que eso es una gran mentira y lo saben mejor que yo. Así que muchas gracias y perdónenme si los he hecho pensar en español, que para mí pensar en inglés me cuesta trabajo. Muchas gracias.
También lo oí, muchos cubanos lo dicen en Estados Unidos también, no solamente en Cuba.
¿Ah, sí? Sí. No, eso, pero en Cuba se decía, ya no, porque una de las cosas que hacemos nosotros en nuestras actividades es dar a conocer no solo la historia del negro en Cuba, sino la del negro en otros países, porque no hacemos por nada con estar ocultando espacios.
Well, finally, Professor Julie Skurski, who's an old friend, and she's a professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center of CUNY, and has published many books. One of them being Anthro-History, published by the University of Michigan Press, will make a few comments about what she has researched.
I'll do it from here, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, thanks so much. Really, there's nothing I can add to such incredibly rich presentations, each one of which deserves to be a talk in itself. So, and I do want to start out by just acknowledging the tremendous work of my dear friend Tomás Fernández, who has really been a pioneer in forging, during the period of Cuban Revolution research on topics of Afro-Cubans, Black intellectuals, public women, Afro-Cuban religions, during a period really when this has not been particularly supported or favored, and it still isn't really, but he has helped open the path for many, many people of all different kinds, so I do want to acknowledge his tremendous work. And here I'll just try to bring together a few of the themes that I think everybody has already been so articulate in bringing out and opening us up to discussion. And what I do see, also because I know the written work of some of the people here, is that they challenge and revise in important ways a number of divisions that have, for quite a while, organized a lot of the work around and on Cuba, both from within Cuba and by scholars from outside. And that kind of revision of the divisions that have typically organized things is difficult, in part because work on Cuba has for a long time been quite politicized and polarized, and you're for or against it in certain kinds of ways. And that has permeated, I think, a lot of the scholarship. So I really admire, and I know it's not easy because of that kind of context, to do this kind of questioning. So just to very briefly mention some of the divisions, which I think they themselves have been very articulate in bringing out. In the historiography, the division between the Republic and the Revolution, or before and after the Revolution, much of which is actually promoted from within kind of official historiography. Another one is a kind of a teleological view, which looks at all events and factors as necessarily leading up to or explaining the Cuban Revolution, versus this much more nuanced and complex view of history, which also looks at conflicts, accidental events, contingency, as well as what has been effectively removed from the lasting narratives. Another area is the contrast between a top-down and also a great man-centered version of history versus social history, also a focus on mass movements. And very related to that is the contrast between male-centered history and, of course, related to the great man, but also more fundamentally, this focus on the public sphere as being the only arena of politics, versus gendered history, which is, I think, really just has so much further to be developed, and is very, very promising. Another contrast is a focus on Cuba as a unified society within a territory, and as being unified around Cubanidad, which has had so much kind of, not just written about it, but is kind of assumed. And versus now this more recent attention to internal differences, and that includes processes of marginalization, discrimination, in some areas around race, gender, and more recently sexual orientation, and of course class differences. And then just finally, a focus on national history as bounded by a territory versus, as we've seen here, a more transnational view of history, one in which links occur through movements as well as ideological currents. And I think part of the ideological occurrences we've seen well expressed here is the issue of political imaginaries, which I think is not to be dismissed as something secondary. When we've heard here, I think, in really interesting ways in the presentations, how political imaginaries themselves can have mobilizing and material effects. So all of these different ways of focusing things that really have brought to my mind the tremendously fruitful work of the great theorist and Haitian American anthropologist Michel Gros-Trujillo, who is also a critic of Eurocentrism. And he analyzed how what he called the silencing of the past is a central dimension in the production of histories. And this includes the carrying out of state-centered silencing of forces and voices from within a society, which I think Michelle Chase's book is bringing out very well, and of course, Machado Roaina's work has long looked at. So I'll just leave it at that, and really also taking up Tomás's invitation to ask how this kind of scholarship is really relevant or can be made more relevant for discussions and activism that are going on in all kinds of places, including within Cuba. So thanks so much.
Thank you.